Well, when I think about the collection of recordings that's featured on this collection, Land of the Sky, it's interesting to think of the 1925 sessions in Asheville as being sort of a predecessor to country music and old time music. But it is also this very interesting reflection of what was going on in the United States at that time in terms of American popular music, because it sort of straddles the line between folkloric music and popular music, which is a big part of Ralph Peer's legacy on American music when it comes to commercial recording, because it's sort of hard for people to kind of wrap their minds around it now. But folk music came in two sort of packages when records began to appear. There was live performance music in a folkloric tradition that was localized communities. And then there was the music that made it onto records, which sometimes could be folk songs in the straight ahead sense. But then there was commercial music that was popular music, copyrighted production songs that were folk music in like the commercial sense. That's why people like Alan Lomax and John Lomax are non-commercial recording technicians compared to Ralph Peer, who was not necessarily trying to get folklore tradition, but he was trying to make a commercial product to sell. So the 1925 sessions show both of those sides of the collecting process, which is really exciting. Absolutely. And it's funny you mention like Kelly Harrell because he and Henry Witter sort of fit in this, and Ernest Stoneman actually fits in this same sort of category where they are halfway in between. They are folkloric musicians coming from rural traditions and family traditions, but they have aspirations to make records. And so they are coming in trying to make popular records. And so it's interesting that you have folks like that that are a part of this mixture. But then you have people like Wade Ward. It's sort of his first recording session, and I'm so glad that we're getting to hear Wade Ward so early because, of course, most people that are fans of his music know his recordings with Alan Lomax in the 1940s with the Bog Trotters, and then his recordings he did afterward, part of the 1960s folk revival, and particularly with Folkways recordings. So it's interesting to hear him in such an early passage. It's almost like an archaeological find that we're hearing an early recording. And then, of course, the song Married Man's Blues is this very interesting pre-blues style of old time banjo number, which is really exciting to hear as well because it gives you a reflection of the repertoire he has. But then also you have acts like the Four Robinson Carolina Club Orchestra, which is an utterly commercial college uh, dance orchestra. And this is very reflective of the type of music that was popular in the post World War I era, going into the 1920s. Even the song I loved, which is College 8, uh, they are actually proclaiming that they are young guys that are breaking away from the traditions of old in terms of fashion. They're wearing baggier clothes and they're wearing flapper outfits and they're not wearing garters like they did in the 1890 in the gay 1890s. And they are proclaiming that the 1920s is here to stay. So it's even interesting that the sentiments are very progressively minded as well as being built on tradition. So it's like, again, we're having this sort of push and pull. And then, of course, there are the wonderful fiddle numbers that are accompanied by both the banjo as well as the piano. When we have people like J.D. Harris, also J.D. McFarlane and daughter. And then, of course, we have people like Jim Couch, who is this very interesting harmonica performer that leads us into some of the sessions that would follow this 1925 Asheville session. Of course, we think of Bristol as being the birthplace of country music, and harmonica players are a part of that session, and they are a part of the sessions that follow into Johnson City, Knoxville, and then later on in 1928 when D. Ford Bailey makes his first recordings in Nashville, we're seeing sort of a snowball effect that is beginning with this Asheville session. So it's something that's really exciting about all of these recordings, just to be able to see the beginning of the snowball effect. What's wonderful about it, what we know now in the 21st century is that we can we can go beyond the surface. Of course, the African American performers were not necessarily featured as the performers themselves, but that doesn't say that there was an influence that is showing up in every performance in some form or another. I've taken some notes here just to kind of break it down a little bit because it is kind of it's sort of a heady idea of how to break this down. First off, um, from 1900, when strict segregation became federal law, everything became separate but equal, and that includes making of records. And so recording sessions were segregated as well. And slowly and steadily, you had integration in recording studios. That's why by the 1960s, when there were groups like Booker T and the MGs that are mixed race groups, that's why these are innovative groups, because up to that point, marketing, recording sessions, all of those things were strictly segregated unless there was an exception to the rule. Taylor's Kentucky Boys, very early on, our example. Um, uh, Andrew Baxter playing with the Georgia Yellowhammers in the late 1920s. Jimmy Rogers in 1931 playing with the various black groups that he played with, the Louisville Jug Band, Louis Armstrong and Lil Hardin and Luke Jordan. You had exceptions that would come along the line. But for the most part, the rule was white recording sessions were for white performers, black recording sessions were for black performers. But that's how they did everything. So any type of ethnic group, if it was Greek music recording sessions, it was Greek recording sessions, Polish recording sessions. So if we think about that, that's one of the reasons why you're not seeing black performers themselves. So going past that, now the first person who kind of sticks out is Emmett Miller, because Emmett Miller, he came from Macon, Georgia. He was a blackface performer, and even when I got into his music, I remember seeing the CD of The Minstrel Man from Georgia, and I just sort of looked at it at the record store, wondering, should I listen to it? Should I not listen to it? And then when I finally decided to break down and buy it because of the song The Lovesick Blues, which is one of Hank Williams' signature numbers, I was surprised to hear such a musical voice coming from Emmett Miller that was very different and unique from the visual artifact of him being in blackface. Now, in the context of the Asheville Sessions, he had a part of his act that was not strictly a blackface act. And what he was presenting was jazz singing. So in the years after the First World War, going into the 1920s, jazz singing, which kind of derived from ragtime singing. Now, it's hard for us to think about now because everyone sings with so much syncopation in most popular music. It's kind of inconceivable to think of pop music not having some type of syncopation. It, you know, she'll be coming round the mountain when she comes. That's kind of straight singing, but is she coming round the mountain when she comes? That's kind of what we expect American singing to have, a little bit of flavor to it. And that's part of the African American influence. That's part of the growth of American popular music. Because you have to imagine this is a time when American music is trying to build an identity that is separate from a European identity. So Emmett Miller is presenting jazz singing. So what he's bringing in are sort of these ideas of ragtime is, I got the ragtime blues. So doubling words, having the when the some of these days, that is jazz singing as it was introduced. So when Emmett Miller comes in, he's doing, I got the he's adding this flavor that is a new musical singing idea. Let's say it that way. But he had his own precedent. So now imagine He was known as the clarinet voiced singer, so he brought in a particular type of yodeling into his singing style. And this is sort of a trend that goes back into the 1840s. So now you have to imagine in 1848. So we have the minor 49ers with the California Gold Rush, but in 1848, 1 million German immigrants came to the United States because of the way that Europe was being formed. A lot of people emigrated and immigrated into the United States. And because of that, there was a large demand for German entertainment. So between the 1830s and the 1850s, there were many Swiss Alps yodeling acts that did German folkloric music, and they traveled up the Mississippi River all the way from Louisiana all the way up to Davenport, Iowa. And so German yodeling was very popular in the years before the Civil War. And also in Appalachian culture, whiskey was the drink, beer was the drink of Germans. So this is also a transition between what you drank in the United States as well. All of this is very important to Emmett Miller because there was this precedent for um, Swiss yodeling. There were entertainers in the vaudeville field that began to focus on that as their feature. And there were African American performers who also featured yodeling in their acts. And there's also an African American yodeling tradition that includes falsetto singing. You hear it in some gospel singing with some early blues singers. You hear people like Tommy Johnson using it. You hear people like Howlin' Wolf using a falsetto yodel style. So there's a combination of all of these different types of yodeling that go into Emmett Miller's then jazz yodeling. So it's a conglomeration of several different types of yodeling styles. Now that's one part of it for the musical aspect of what Emmett Miller's presenting. A second part of it to consider is Jimmy Rogers is said to have been influenced by Emmett Miller. It's sort of a murky area of when they met, why they were contemporaries of each other. But the facts we do know is Jimmy Rogers knew about Emmett Miller from Asheville, and then he brought his music that he played in Asheville uh, in a string band. He broke away from a string band, went down to Bristol, and then began to record at the first Bristol session, which became his entry point into the music industry. So now, taking that idea, the Asheville Sessions now give us a clear, definitive moment when Emmett Miller is in Asheville making records, and he is a part of the Asheville music scene in one form or another. And then newspapers mentioned that Emmett Miller was quite popular, so he came through town often. So now we have a point where Jimmy Rogers is meeting him. A secondary person to think about, there's an African American yodeler that was an influence on Jimmy Rogers, and I speculate on Emmett Miller as well. His name was Charles Anderson. He also recorded for OKeh Records. Now, his recordings were, he made a recording of Sleep Baby Sleep, which is from 1869, back in October of 1923. Jimmy Rogers records this very same song at the first Bristol session. And so Charles Anderson has an influence on Jimmy Rogers. So most times when you read about him, Jimmy Rogers is influenced by African American gandy dancers and railroad workers. But there is a black vaudevillian performer who's a guy in a tuxedo that's doing yodels and blues numbers and sentimental songs. And that is his act as well. So Jimmy Rogers is probably tuned into Charles Anderson in some sort of way because also Charles Anderson's making records. And then even 8 months before the Asheville sessions themselves, he makes a series of recordings, including a song called Roll on Silver Moon, that for big fans of Jimmy Rogers sounds a lot like Miss the Mississippi and You in terms of form and structure. Now, what's interesting about Charles Anderson, though, and this is kind of the sticking point when it comes to Emmett Miller and later Jimmy Rogers, is that Charles Anderson's yodel is so intense when you're hearing his recordings. He's like singing really far out there, hitting every note, but it's very intense coming through the speakers, even to this day. And so the power of the recording process at that point was figuring out how to sing your song so that it sounded comfortable for a person sitting in front of a Victrola. And you can see that Emmett Miller and later Jimmy Rogers figured out a way to be able to create a comfortable setting for their voices so that it translated on the records. And of course, this is something Ralph Peer talked about a lot as well. So that's a little bit of Charles Anderson. He's also the first person to sing the song The St. Louis Blues and many of the first blues numbers that were published in 1912. And even Ethel Waters mentions him in passing because Charles Anderson used to do an act where he played an old woman and sang the St. Louis Blues. Ethel Waters saw him perform it and then decided to start performing the St. Louis Blues, and she became the first woman to popularize that song, the St. Louis Blues. And so Charles Anderson has this very influential role as a black vaudevillian. And this translates to when Emmett Miller is making his recordings, his very first recordings in front of the microphone. He is another specialist of this particular style of singing. And of course, his legacy later on, he records songs like Anytime, Right or Wrong, Lovesick Blues, which would all become part of the Western swing repertoire, as well as honky tonk, as well as some of the early country singers. So anyway, that's a lot of information, but it tells a lot of the way that African American music was influencing the new wave of performing. Then there are smaller examples like harmonica playing with Jim Couch. There was a fellow named Pete Hampton who recorded back even in 1904. He recorded harmonica specialty numbers on wax cylinder, and he featured the Fox Chase, the Train, and the Mama Blues, which are three distinctive showpieces on the harmonica in the African American tradition. And he did that for dozens and dozens of cylinder recordings while he traveled in Europe, even though he was from Bowling Green, Kentucky. So that's like a precedent for harmonica playing in the cylinder era. But then, of course, you have Jim Couch doing his recordings, which sound fantastic. And then 2 years later in Bristol, you have the mysterious L. Watson recording his few numbers on the harmonica during that time. So there's even this period of time when white and black harmonica players are playing a similar repertoire. Of course, Henry Witter had made his own recordings of the Fox Chase and things like that, and it would culminate into a very illustrious tradition that even included folks like the Carolina Tar Heels, which featured Gwen Foster and Garley Foster coming from Gastonia, not terribly far away from Asheville. And then I guess the final part I will mention, well, there's a couple other bits that are actually very interesting. So a timeline of African American folkloric song, because I mentioned that the recordings were segregated, and it was not particularly, it wasn't in vogue to have performances recorded of folkloric and untrained talent, untested talent, as they called it at that time. Most time you'd have to have a professional performer, a professional songwriter who published a song, and then you recorded it. Back in 1920, African-American songwriter named Perry Bradford, he convinced the OKeh Company to record a black woman by the name of Mamie Smith, who he worked with, to record her singing one of his songs that he had written, the Crazy Blues, and to be accompanied by a black jazz band doing improvised jazz. And that was back in August of 1920. And the Crazy Blues started the trend for what became race records, which was African American marketed records, because Perry Bradford basically made the case that there would be black record buyers that would buy records, because at that time the record companies didn't think that the black community would be able to shell out 75 cents for a record, and Perry Bradford actually proved that wrong. And so it seems incredulous now, like, how could you not have black music or think there's a black record buying public, but at that time it was such a new idea. And the same thing for rural Southern white audiences as well, which is what the Asheville Sessions was about, which was, you know, will people shell out 75 cents to buy a record of their own music? And so, in the modern days of YouTube and of Instagram and things like that, we can kind of focus and think about user-generated data. But this is an early version of a user-generated data where the record companies then would follow trends. So when it comes to African American blues, you know, there was the first black-owned record company, Black Swan Records. That was in 1921. They folded in 1924 and sold to Paramount Records. And so in 1923, in October, you had the first guitar accompanied blues record from Sarah Martin, uh, accompanied by Sylvester Weaver. It was a song called Longing for Daddy Blues. And that set the trend for guitar accompanied blues. And by April of 1924, there was the first country blues male singer. It was Barrel House Blues by Ed Andrews from Georgia, and then followed by Papa Charlie Jackson in August of 1924, being the first solo accompanied blues singer to make popular records on a six-string banjo. He had his record Airy Man Blues. In October of 1924, you have Lee Morse, who's one of the first guitar self-accompanied blues singers making a record, Mailman Blues. And then that's followed after the sessions by Lonnie Johnson making his first records in November of 1925 for the OKeh Company as well. So it's also, he won on a blues contest and got a record contract that way. So it was already after there was a precedent that they're trying to find people. And so Lonnie Johnson sets a trend for blues. And then finally, Paramount Records in December of 1925 records Blind Lemon Jefferson, setting the trend for rural, uninhibited blues singing on record. And it's so you're seeing there's a lot of different trends that are coming down the line. The last two things, I guess the last few things I'll mention when it comes to actual recordings and African American influence, you have like the Royal Clog from Ernest Helton, and it was interesting to read the liner notes to this package where you have Ernest Helton is playing an old-timey banjo number that is sort of reminiscent of the stroke style of the 1890s. Uh, and he's playing sort of a three-finger style. And his older brother, Osi, learned from an African American fiddler who worked with their father. And then you also find out that these fellows are half Cherokee and half white. So there's a story of a multicultural Appalachia that is already emerging just from this one recording. And of course, when you think of three finger playing for folks that are deep into the old time music and are interested in the African American influence, there are field recordings from the Library of Congress of people like the Gribble Luskin York Band, as well as Nathan Frazier and Frank Patterson, who are featured on the Altamont record, where they are featuring early three-finger style playing. And so this Royal Clog is like another recording that shows this trend of three-finger that's not bluegrass, but it's a little bit more syncopated and has a little bit more drive than just standard clawhammer, which of course is great to have next to the Wade Ward. And you can hear the difference between clawhammer and sort of this three-finger style of roll that's coming up. Fisher Hendley, Let the Shack Burn On Down. I mean, it's just a straight hesitation blues, which was a song that was known in different houses of ill repute. So this was a song that was very racy for its time. And of course, you can look in the notes and see the flip side and see that he's also referencing Black culture in a different type of way, which is the title of the number. And so that's something that's worth keeping in mind, because also he had his own elaborate career following the Asheville Sessions. So this is sort of the beginning. So you get to see Fisher Hendley as he's starting out, and also the hesitation blues is very reminiscent of Uncle Dave Macon's Hillbilly Blues, which is a sort of another early um, old time blues banjo number, which is very unique to think about because, of course, in mountain culture, the blues made its way in as a style. And so there were a lot of people that were incorporating the blues going back to the turn of the 20th century, going into the first copyrighted blues from 1912. And then the final one, which was sort of an interesting random track that sort of got me thinking about an African American performer and their style of playing, was the American and Spanish Fandango from R.B. Smith and S.J. Allgood. Now, both the Spanish Fandango is a song that comes from a fellow named Henry Worrell, who was a guitar instructor, and he made a guitar method book that featured this song, the Spanish Fandango. And then the tuning associated with Spanish Fandango became the open G tuning that people would use for slide guitar and in country and blues music. So that's one part of the story with the song itself. But then the way that the banjos are playing in a duet style, I could not help but think about the recordings of Etta Baker and her sister Cora Phillips. And they played in a very similar style of parlor banjo with two banjos or a banjo and a guitar playing in tight unison with each other. And this particular recording to me sounded so similar to the two of them. I actually went and looked back on a liner notes booklet of one of the Etta Baker albums I had, and she mentions that they had a radio and a phonograph back in 1927 when they moved back to moved back to Morganton, North Carolina. So she was about 15, 13 years old when the sessions themselves happened. So it got me to think an interesting speculation of Etta Baker possibly having access to a recording that was made contemporary to her own time, especially in a formative year when her father's also a banjo player. You know, he could possibly have picked up the record and then she might have picked up something. I don't know what, but maybe picked up a little bit of that flavor because the style is so similar to some of Etta Baker's numbers that I just couldn't help but be drawn into that. But that's sort of it in a nutshell when it comes to like kind of African American music that I saw within it. Of course, I mean St. Louis Tickle is a very famous ragtime number. Cacklin' Hen is also a number that's sort of stock music from the black and white tradition. But then it's just it's just a joyful listen to hear all this wonderful music. And then Bascom Lamar Lunsford is another fellow who is he's a very tricky individual where he has all of these songs that are African American influenced, but on the surface, it would seem like he's not particularly progressively minded, but his music speaks volumes that maybe he might not have been able to speak in his time. You know, it's interesting. You know, it's also reflective in a way of how far we've come technologically, where we can actually have cleaned up performances of all of these recordings to where they're listenable to a modern ear, at least more so. Now, you have to imagine this. So in Barry Mazur's book that he wrote several years back on Ralph Peer, one of the ways to describe Ralph Peer is sort of like a techie, like thinking like he's loving the music in one way, but he's thinking about it in a technical sense of how to capture it in the highest quality and form. So one of the most misquoted phrases that Ralph Pearce said in his entire career was that when he recorded Fiddlin' John Carson back in 1923, that the recordings that he made, they sounded pluperfect awful. And it has always been attributed to Ralph Peer's dislike of old-timey music. And in Barry Mazur's book, he actually clears up the sentiment itself. And one of the things that Ralph Peer was saying was because the recording, the situation in which the records were made, there was like a wall that was set up in a certain type of way. The sound echoed in a particular way so that when Ralph Peer heard those records back, he said, "Oh, they just sound awful," but in a fidelity sense. But then he just gave them to Polk Brockman, who was also present at the Asheville Sessions. Again, it's also there's a through line with all the people that are involved. So he gives these records of Fiddlin' John Carson to Polk Brockman, and Polk Brockman then sells them all and asks for another repressing of the record, which in it itself gives birth to the old familiar tunes, or the hillbilly record industry, similar to what happened to Mamie Smith with Crazy Blues, but its own version of Southern white vernacular music. So, and Polk Brockman, it's interesting as well. He's a furniture store owner of the type that you have to think of, like if Raymore and Flanagan got into the record business or something like that. He's selling cabinet record players and then selling the records that go with it. So you get 10 records for your cabinet that you buy. So it's kind of the commerce of records is very much in the we're trying to sell the cabinets. Even with Ralph Peer, he met the OKeh Company when they were still a button making company. So they were a button making company, and then they decided to get into records. Just like Paramount Records, they were another furniture company out of
Yeah.
Grafton, Wisconsin, and then they decided to get into the record business. So it's these the people that are behind the sessions, they're not necessarily thinking about musical quality, but when you start to have people like Ralph Peer come into play, Ralph Peer's smart enough to direct and delegate so that there are informed people on the ground that are bringing in musicians that are of high quality and of note in the local community, so that then they could meet with proprietors like Pope Brockman and Peer himself, and then bring in new material so that they can make really great records. It's the birth of A&R, artist and repertoire, because that's what was needed at that time. What artists were good, what sounded good on record, and then what repertoire made sense for them so that you could get the highest quality record. And this is why someone like Bascom Lamar Lunsford, where you have a translation of him being a part of the Atlanta Sessions, which was a part of this early birth of hillbilly records. He is the one that's tipping Pierre off to Asheville. And of course, in Asheville, we're talking about they're not, again, we think about it as being like up in the mountains in some holler somewhere where they're recording this, but they're at the George Vanderbilt Hotel. Um, but again, this is reflective of an earlier era, because 10 years earlier, Cecil Sharp was also collecting folk songs, but he went to the hollers from the Biltmore estate. He didn't, his launching pad wasn't from like a rural enclave. He was in a really high class Art Deco like facility hotel place where he then is making his way out to these rural enclaves to go to the people from a base of operations, which is actually super classy. And so it's kind of a funny juxtaposition again of modernity versus going deep into the heart of a community and finding material that goes back sometimes hundreds of years. This is something that Alan Lomax talked about quite often as well, is that even in the most urban centers, you can find music that goes back generations if you find the right people. And the only way you can do that is by going into the communities, finding people or delegating, or in Lomax's case, he would go out himself, find the people that would lead him down a rabbit hole and a pathway that would be much deeper. So it's an interesting sort of pattern of this sort of two, like I don't know, two battling sides of the musical equation. Well, I think they're just exciting musical performances. And I think when we take all the history and move it aside, I think one of the beauties of it is that now that we have been able to elevate the sound quality past what, again, Ralph Peer thought that there was such a low quality of recording that it could not translate as commercial music. That's why Bristol has become more of the birthplace of country music, is because they figured out the method to crystallize a very high quality recording. But now in the 21st century, to be able to have these earlier recordings presented in a much more high fidelity fashion, that's something that allows us to be able to see 2 years before. Because of course, Ernest Stoneman is a part of this recording session. Now, he's the guy who tips Ralph Peer to Bristol. So we're even seeing Bascom tips him to Asheville, and then Stoneman tips him to Bristol. So we're seeing the people that are making an effect on one session, leading to the next, and that we're looking at a full trajectory down the Appalachian Trailway to get to the next session, to show that there's even a path of discovery that's happening all along the way. And then, of course, just to kind of touch upon African American performers one more time, those barriers begin to break down. Even though the African American performers are not present in Asheville, they begin to have one in Bristol, and then by the time they have a second session in Bristol, Tarter and Gay, they begin to make recordings by 1928. Then in Nashville, D. Ford Bailey's making his first recordings. And then you have the Knoxville Sessions, where the Tennessee Chocolate Drops and Will Bennett begin to make recordings. And then the Johnson City Sessions, where you start to have Leola Manning, and you start to have all of these black jazz bands starting to appear. So the movement toward black performers being a part of these recording sessions is happening. But at the time, for 1925, this is still a time when segregation is so strict that that isn't a factor, because the sessions for black performers are being done still in the city centers of New York and in Chicago. And then also a lot of the innovative recordings have been made in the decade preceding 1925, leading into 1925, because of course Louis Armstrong's made his great recordings. Mamie Smith, as I mentioned before, Ma Rainey, all of these performers are making recordings in different parts of the country in the years leading up to the Asheville Sessions. So when I was talking before about jazz singing, this is a reflection of what's been happening in the decade from 1920 to 1925. So the presence, while the performers themselves weren't a part of this specific session, the presence of African American musical form and culture are starting to build. And that's something that I think, if we think of it that way, just to be able to see old time music and mountain music as it was being presented at that time, I think this collection will be a real treasure trove for people that are longtime fans, and then for folks that are just interested for the first time, because I think it's very exciting music.